Most people think Family Guy just throws jokes at every group equally and calls it fair. Equal opportunity offense. Nothing personal, nobody spared. But one media researcher pointed out something stranger buried inside 25 years of episodes. In this video, we break down every race Peter Griffin has ever offended, the format itself, why Quahog's news desk is the blueprint. Before Family Guy ever builds a full episode around one ethnic group, it already has a running joke sitting quietly in the background of almost every single episode. That joke lives inside the local news desk at Channel 5 in Quahog, Rhode Island, the fictional town where the Griffin family lives. Long before the show tackles an entire half hour about immigration or religion or a specific culture, it has already built two characters whose entire purpose is to be defined by their race every single time they appear on screen. Those two characters are Trisha Takanawa, the news reporter, and Ollie Williams, the weatherman. Understanding how these two characters work is the starting point for understanding everything else this video is going to cover, because the news desk is where the show first reveals its actual method. It is not just telling jokes about race. It is building a repeating structure that uses race as the punchline delivery system itself over and over for more than 2 decades of episodes. Trisha Takanawa first appears in the earliest days of the show, and from her very first appearance, she is never simply introduced as a reporter. She is introduced as the Asian reporter. This is not a description that happens once and then gets dropped. It becomes a permanent piece of her name inside the show, repeated by the news anchor almost every single time he hands the broadcast over to her. Anchor Tom Tucker will say something like, "We go now to Asian reporter Trisha Takanawa," and this phrasing shows up across dozens of episodes, spanning multiple decades of the show's run. Her professional title, her job, her actual function on the news desk, all of that becomes secondary to the fact that the show wants the audience to hear her ethnicity every time she speaks. She is voiced by Alex Borstein, who also voices Lois Griffin, the mother of the family, and Borstein plays Trisha with a flat, calm, almost robotic delivery, no matter what chaos is happening around her. Whether she is standing in the middle of a hurricane, reporting on a giant chicken fighting a man in a costume, or covering something genuinely disturbing, her voice barely changes. That flatness is part of the joke, but the ethnic labeling sitting on top of it is a separate joke that never goes away. Ollie Williams works in a similar way, but through a completely different technique. He is the weatherman and sports reporter for the same news station, and his forecasts are called Black-O-Weather, a name that fuses the word black directly onto the weather segment. Ollie is voiced by Phil Lamar, an actor with a long career voicing many different animated characters across many different shows. What makes Ollie's segments distinct is their length. Where Trisha gets full scenes and sometimes extended dialogue, Ollie is usually given only a few seconds of screen time per episode, and inside those few seconds, he shouts a single short phrase and nothing more. He might scream that it is raining sideways. He might scream that everybody outside looks like ants. He might simply scream one word. Then the broadcast cuts away from him and moves on, and the show almost never returns to him again until the next time a weather report is needed. Across the entire run of the show, Ollie is almost never given a real scene of his own. One clear exception happens in the episode Peter Asment, where Peter Griffin becomes an amateur photographer chasing local celebrities for pictures, and Ollie physically confronts him, punching him and breaking his camera and his glasses. This is treated by fans and by the show's own internal reference material as Ollie's longest appearance in the entire series, which says something important about how small his usual role actually is. The reason this section exists at the start of the video is that these two characters are not built around a single controversial episode, the way many of the later sections in this video will be. There is no one specific Trisha Takanawa episode, or one specific Ollie Williams episode that critics point to as the moment things went wrong. Instead, what makes makes these two characters worth examining first is that they represent the quiet, constant version of the show's racial humor, the version that never takes a week off. A single controversial storyline airs once, and then the show moves on to a different topic the following week. But Trisha and Ollie are structural. They show up constantly, almost every time the news desk appears, which is itself a frequent device the show uses to interrupt the main plot for a joke. Because of that constant repetition, these two characters actually reveal more about how the show thinks about race than almost any single storyline does, simply because of how often the audience is exposed to the pattern. Look closely at what the show is actually doing with the news desk format itself, separate from any one specific joke inside it. Local television news in real life has a long, well-documented history of what is sometimes called tokenism, meaning newsrooms that make a visible effort to include reporters from different racial backgrounds, often placing them in specific roles, like weather or sports, rather than the main anchor chair. Family Guy is clearly aware of this real pattern and is making fun of it directly. The show is not simply making jokes about Asian people or black people in a vacuum. It is making a joke about how television networks have historically handled diversity, reducing reporters to a checklist of visible categories rather than treating them as individuals with equal screen time and equal narrative weight. This is worth naming clearly because it changes how the joke should be read. The target of the joke is partly the television industry's own habits, not only the ethnic groups being represented inside that industry. However, naming that intention does not erase what actually ends up on screen. Even if the underlying target is the news industry, the actual mechanism of the joke still requires reducing a Japanese American woman to a single ethnic label repeated dozens of times, and it still requires giving a black man dramatically less dialogue and screen time than his white coworkers, communicated to the audience through comedy that treats his short, shouted lines as inherently funny simply because of who is saying them. Both things can be true at once. The show can be aiming its satire at real news industry habits while also reproducing the very reduction it claims to be mocking. This is actually one of the most useful ideas for understanding Family Guy's racial humor as a whole, and it will come up again and again across this video. The show frequently claims it is punching at a larger target, whether that target is media or politics or culture, but the actual joke on screen often lands directly on the group being depicted rather than on the system surrounding them. Looking specifically at how these jokes are constructed reveals something else worth noticing. Trisha's jokes tend to lean toward specific ideas about Asian culture and Asian womanhood. In one frequently cited example, when interviewing the musician David Bowie, Trisha's calm reporter voice breaks and she becomes visibly infatuated, telling him she will take him home and make him a specific Asian dish. The joke here works by suddenly stripping away her professional composure and replacing it with an exaggerated, almost animal level of desire, tied specifically to her ethnic background through the choice of food she mentions. Her family life follows a similar pattern. Her mother, voiced by actress Amy Hill, is written as a strict, emotionally cold parent who is hard on her daughter, playing into a widely recognized idea about Asian parenting styles being unusually severe and demanding compared to other cultures. These two elements, the sudden sexual outburst and the harsh parental relationship, are both drawn directly from long-standing ideas about Asian people that already existed in American popular culture well before Family Guy started using them. The show did not invent these ideas. It picked them up from a much longer history of similar jokes in other movies and shows, and simply applied them to its own cast of characters. Ollie's jokes work through a completely different method, built entirely around volume and brevity rather than sexuality or family family dynamics. Nearly every one of his lines is delivered as a short, loud, grammatically simple shout. He does not speak in full, calm sentences the way Tom Tucker or the other anchors do. His sentences are stripped down to the fewest possible words, shouted with maximum intensity, and then the scene cuts away immediately. This pattern draws on a specific and much older idea in American comedy, sometimes referred to by critics as the angry black man trope. A shorthand where a black character's emotional expression is reduced to loud, aggressive bursts rather than complex speech. Defenders of the character argue that the real joke is aimed at the news industry's obsession with dramatic, high-energy field reporting, using Ali as an exaggerated stand-in for that entire style of broadcast journalism. Critics counter that, regardless of the intended target, the actual joke still relies on a black man being funny, specifically because he is loud, brief, and emotionally simplified, compared to his white colleagues, who are allowed full paragraphs and complete thoughts. It is worth pointing out that the show occasionally breaks its own pattern with these two characters, and those moments are useful because they show that the writers were at least aware, on some level, that there was more to these characters than the joke format usually allowed. In one episode, Ali appears outside of his usual reporting duties entirely, shown attending a support group for people who have been harmed or traumatized by the main characters over the years. In this scene, he is still speaking in his usual shouted style, but the show gives him a hint of real sadness underneath it, suggesting that the character understands his own situation and feels something about being stuck in what the show itself treats as a permanent performance. It is a small moment, lasting only a short time, but it is one of the very few instances across the entire series where Ali is treated as someone with an inner life rather than purely as a punchline delivery machine. Trisha receives a similar small moment during a storyline where her character genuinely believes she has seriously injured Peter Griffin, and the show allows her a brief scene of real fear and guilt rather than her usual flat delivery. These moments do not undo the pattern built around both characters, but they do suggest that somewhere in the writer's room, there was an understanding that both characters had been kept fairly thin for a very long time. The cultural context surrounding all of this matters as well, and it explains why these jokes might have landed very differently for audiences watching the show when it first aired compared to audiences discovering it today. Family Guy premiered in 1999, a period in American television when local news parody was already a common comedic target on several other shows, and where jokes about diversity hires in newsrooms were considered fairly mainstream and not especially controversial. Audiences in that era were generally more accustomed to broad ethnic caricature across many forms of entertainment, and there was less public conversation at the time about how repeated small jokes can add up to a larger pattern over years of exposure. As the show continued into the 2000s and then the 2010s and beyond, the wider cultural conversation around representation in media changed considerably, with far more attention paid to how minor characters are treated compared to lead characters, and how repeated ethnic labeling, even when framed as a joke, can reinforce the idea that certain groups exist mainly to be defined by their background rather than by their individual personality. Watching Trisha and Ollie through today's eyes means noticing something that many viewers in 1999 simply were not trained to notice yet, which is how much weight sits inside a joke that gets repeated hundreds of times across more than 20 years of episodes. There is also a generational angle worth naming here, because it connects to something that will come up throughout the rest of this video. Family Guy has been on the air long enough that some of its earliest viewers were children when the show began, and are now adults raising their own families. For a significant portion of its audience, these characters characters were not something they encountered once as a shocking surprise. They were part of the ordinary background of a Sunday night cartoon, absorbed slowly and repeatedly over hundreds of episodes, without much conscious thought given to the pattern underneath. This kind of slow, repeated exposure works differently than a single shocking episode. A single controversial storyline can be discussed, debated, and remembered as one specific event. A running joke built into the format of the show, repeated in nearly every episode for over 20 years, becomes something closer to wallpaper, absorbed without much active thought. And that quiet, constant repetition may have done more to shape how an entire generation thinks about race and comedy than any single headline-grabbing episode ever could. This is exactly why the news desk deserves to open this video, rather than being treated as a minor detail buried somewhere in the middle. Every other section in this video will look at a specific storyline built around a specific ethnic group, examined once in a single episode or a small handful of episodes. This section is different because it is not about a single storyline at all. It is about the underlying machinery the show built very early on and then never really took apart. Tricia Takanawa and Ollie Williams prove that Family Guy's racial humor was never limited to occasional shock value storylines saved for special episodes. It was baked into the basic structure of the show from its earliest days, present in ordinary, everyday scenes that had nothing to do with race as the main subject, simply because the news desk itself was built around race as a permanent punchline. Connecting all of this back to the larger argument driving this entire video, the pattern established here at the news desk becomes the lens through which every following section should be understood. Family Guy's comedy machine rarely singles out one ethnic group for one isolated joke and then moves on completely. It tends to build small, repeatable pieces, whether that is a character's accent, a character's job title, or a character's family background, and then it returns to that same piece again and again across many episodes and many years. Tricia's ethnic labeling and Ollie's shouted brevity are the clearest, most repeated examples of this method anywhere in the entire show, precisely because they show up in almost every single episode, rather than being confined to one special installment built entirely around a theme. Every other section in this video will look at storylines that are bigger, louder, and often more shocking than anything happening at the Channel 5 news desk, but none of them will be as constant, and understanding that constancy first makes everything that follows easier to see clearly. Something else worth carrying forward from this opening section is the idea that intention and impact are not always the same thing, a distinction that came up earlier when discussing whether the news desk jokes are really aimed at the television industry or at the ethnic groups themselves. This gap between what a joke claims to be about and what it actually reduces a person to on screen will reappear constantly throughout this video, sometimes in much sharper and more direct form than anything found in these two recurring characters. The news desk is a fairly mild version of this gap compared to what comes later, since some of the storylines still ahead build an entire episode around one ethnic group rather than a few seconds of screen time. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Ollie Williams has stood at that same news desk since the very beginning, right alongside one of Peter Griffin's closest friends, a man whose accent and appearance become their own recurring joke across dozens of episodes. That friendship reaches its sharpest, most direct moment on a golf course, in a scene where the show says the quiet part out loud. Section 2. The Black Community, Cleveland, Ollie Williams, and the Golf Course Mask. The first section of this video looked at how Family Guy built race into the basic structure of its news desk before it ever built a single storyline around any one ethnic group. That pattern, where a joke about identity sits quietly in the the background of nearly every episode becomes even clearer once the show moves away from the newsroom and into its cast of actual friends and neighbors. Ollie Williams already showed one version of how black characters get treated on this show, reduced to a few seconds of screen time and a single shouted phrase. But Ollie is a minor character who exists almost entirely inside news segments. Cleveland Brown is different. He is one of Peter Griffin's closest friends, present in the main cast from the very beginning of the series, given his own family, his own home, his own storylines, and eventually his own spin-off show. Because Cleveland has so much more presence than Ollie, the way the show writes him reveals something deeper about how Family Guy handles race when it actually gives a black character room to exist as a full person rather than a background gag. Cleveland Brown first appears as part of Peter's regular group of friends, alongside Quagmire and Joe, the three men who gather at the Drunken Clam bar and get pulled into most of Peter's schemes across the run of the show. From his earliest appearances, Cleveland is written as calm, easygoing, and slow to anger, a deliberate contrast to Peter's chaos, Quagmire's aggressive personality, and Joe's frustration over being paralyzed and unable to join in on many physical activities. Cleveland's personality on paper is mostly gentle and even-tempered. Where the show introduces race into his character is not primarily through his personality, but through the way he speaks. Cleveland is given a specific vocal pattern by his voice actor, where certain words are pronounced differently than they would be by the other characters around him. Words like marriage and Mary come out sounding closer to Murridge and Murray. This is not a random speech quirk applied evenly across the cast. It is applied specifically and consistently to Cleveland, and it draws on a long-running idea in American comedy, where black characters are given altered pronunciation as a built-in joke, separate from anything they are actually saying. The content of Cleveland's sentences is often perfectly ordinary. The humor is placed entirely on how those ordinary sentences sound coming out of his mouth. This distinction matters because it shows a specific technique that shows up across many decades of American television and film, where a performer or a character is not given jokes to tell so much as they are turned into the joke simply by how they sound. Cleveland is rarely the one delivering a punchline built around clever timing or a surprising observation the way Peter or Stewie or Brian often are. Instead, a large portion of his comedic value on the show comes from an audience recognizing his voice pattern and finding it funny purely because of the pattern itself. This is a much older comedic device than Family Guy, going back decades before the show existed, and it is worth naming plainly rather than treating it as something unique to this particular cartoon. Family Guy did not invent this technique. It picked up an existing and widely recognized pattern from earlier American entertainment and applied it directly onto one of its central characters, using it consistently enough that it becomes one of the first things many longtime viewers associate with Cleveland whenever his name comes up. Cleveland's home life follows a similar pattern of being mostly ordinary, with occasional moments where his race becomes the specific subject of a joke, rather than simply a background trait. He is married to Loretta Brown for a significant stretch of the show's run, and their household includes his son, Cleveland Jr., along with Loretta's daughter, Roberta. Much of what happens inside the Brown household mirrors what happens inside any other family on the show, filled with the same kind of domestic squabbles, parenting struggles, and small personal dramas that Peter and Lois experience in their own home. This matters because it means Cleveland is not written purely as a walking stereotype, with no ordinary life outside of jokes about his race. He gets a home, a marriage, children, and a full set of storylines that have nothing to do with being black at all, which puts him in a slightly different category than a character like Ollie Williams, who almost never gets any life outside of his brief on-screen shouting. However, one of the most significant storylines involving Cleveland's marriage does bring race directly into the center of the plot, and it happens in the episode The Cleveland-Loretta Quagmire. In this storyline, Cleveland discovers that his wife, Loretta, has been having an affair with Quagmire, Cleveland's close friend and fellow member of Peter's social group. The episode plays out largely as a story about betrayal and friendship, following the fallout of Cleveland learning about the affair and eventually confronting both his wife and his friend. What makes this storyline relevant to a discussion of race is not the affair plot itself, which functions the same way an affair storyline would in almost any sitcom about marriage and friendship, but rather how the show chooses to insert an unrelated joke into the middle of the episode, involving a hospital patient with an advanced case of AIDS. In that separate sequence, Peter leads a barbershop quartet through the hospital room of a man dying from the disease, singing and dancing around his bed as part of a musical number. This particular sequence is frequently cited by critics and by advocacy groups focused on AIDS awareness as one of the most tasteless moments in the show's entire run, not because it targets Black people specifically, since the patient in the scene is not identified as part of any particular racial storyline, but because it uses a serious and often fatal illness as the setup for an upbeat musical joke. It is included here because this episode carries Cleveland's name in its title and represents one of his most significant personal storylines, even though the most widely discussed controversy inside the episode is a separate scene entirely. The clearest and most direct moment connecting Cleveland's friendship circle to a specific joke about race happens away from his own household entirely, on a golf course, in a scene that has been discussed and referenced across multiple analyses of the show's handling of racial humor. In this sequence, Peter convinces Cleveland to wear a mask depicting a white man's face while the two of them go golfing together. When Cleveland questions why he needs to wear this mask at all, the scene answers the question directly rather than leaving it implied. Cleveland removes the mask, and immediately a pair of white men walking nearby notice him and react with visible alarm, with one of them clenching his fists as though preparing to respond aggressively simply because he has spotted a Black man playing golf. This sequence is worth examining closely because, unlike many of the jokes discussed elsewhere in this video, it does not rely on subtext or on an audience needing outside knowledge to understand what point is being made. The scene states its point in plain terms. A Black man cannot walk onto a golf course without a mask covering his identity without provoking a hostile reaction from white strangers nearby. This is not a joke about Cleveland's personality, his voice, or his family life. It is a joke built directly around the real and well-documented history of Black golfers facing discrimination and exclusion from country clubs and golf courses across much of American history, a history that persisted formally in many private clubs well into the second half of the 20th century. What makes this scene different from many of the other examples discussed throughout this video is where the show chooses to place its punchline. In several of the other cases already covered, including the news desk format from the previous section, the joke depends on exaggerating or mocking traits associated with the minority character themselves, whether that is an accent, a job title, or a family stereotype. The golf course scene works in the opposite direction. The joke is aimed entirely at the two white bystanders and their instinctive, aggressive reaction to seeing a Black man in a space they apparently believe should not include him. Cleveland himself is not written as foolish, exaggerated, or the source of comedy in this particular sequence. He is simply present, calm, and unbothered, while the joke lands entirely on the absurdity and hostility of the white reaction around him. This distinction is worth sitting with carefully because it shows that Family Guy is capable of building race-based humor that targets prejudice itself rather than targeting the person experiencing that prejudice, even while so many other examples across the show do the exact opposite. This contrast becomes even more meaningful when placed next to the earlier discussion of Ollie Williams and the news desk format. Ollie's humor depends almost entirely on exaggerating traits associated with him personally, reducing reducing his character to a handful of shouted phrases delivered because of who he is, rather than because of any specific situation he finds himself in. The golf course scene with Cleveland flips that structure. The humor comes from the situation and the reaction of the people around him, rather than from Cleveland's own traits or behavior. Both scenes involve black characters, and both scenes are frequently cited by people discussing the show's history with race, but they represent two very different comedic strategies sitting inside the same television series. One strategy makes the minority character the butt of the joke through exaggeration. The other strategy makes the surrounding prejudice itself the target, with the minority character serving as the calm center around which that prejudice is exposed. Understanding that Family Guy is capable of both approaches, sometimes within the same season or even the same character's storyline, is important for building an accurate picture of the show rather than a simplified one. It is also worth mentioning that Cleveland eventually became significant enough within the wider world of the show to be given his own spin-off series, The Cleveland Show, which ran for 4 seasons starting in 2009 and followed Cleveland after he moves away from Quahog with his family to a new town. The existence of this spin-off matters for this discussion because it shows that, unlike many minor recurring characters on the show, Cleveland was considered substantial enough by the network and by the creators to support an entire separate series built around his life, his family, and his own set of relationships and storylines. This stands in sharp contrast to a character like Ollie Williams, who never receives anything close to that level of narrative investment, remaining a background joke delivery device for the entire run of the original show. The difference between these two outcomes says something meaningful about how the show's writers viewed each character. Cleveland was written with enough depth and enough audience interest behind him to justify building an entire additional show around his life, even while his voice pattern and his general presence on the original series still carried the racial coding discussed earlier in this section. None of this erases the specific joke construction built around Cleveland's speech pattern, which remained a consistent feature of his character across the original series and into his own spin-off show as well. Even with a full family, a full spin-off, and storylines that treat him as a genuine central character rather than a background prop, the accent joke persists as one of his defining traits throughout. This shows that giving a character more screen time and more narrative depth does not automatically remove the racial coding built into how that character was originally designed. Cleveland received far more development than Ollie Williams ever did, and yet the specific vocal joke tied to his race remained a constant throughout his entire time on screen, suggesting that this particular choice was treated by the show's writers as a permanent and unchangeable part of who the character was, regardless of how much additional depth surrounded it. Looking at Cleveland's overall place in the show, alongside the golf course scene, and his general voice pattern, gives a more complete picture of how Family Guy handles black characters compared to the picture given by Ollie Williams alone, where Ollie represents the show at its most reductive, offering almost no screen time outside of a racially coded joke format. Cleveland represents something more layered. He receives a marriage, a family, close friendships, an entire spin-off series, and at least one specific scene, the golf course sequence, where the show turns its comedic lens directly onto racial prejudice itself, rather than onto the character experiencing it. At the same time, his signature vocal pattern remains present throughout his entire run on screen, tying him permanently to a comedic device with a long and well-documented history in earlier American entertainment. Both of these things exist simultaneously inside the same character, and understanding Cleveland requires holding both facts at once rather than choosing only one side of his portrayal to focus on. This dual nature inside a single character becomes a useful pattern to carry forward into the rest of this video, because it will show up again and again across different ethnic groups the show has depicted over its long run. Very few of the storylines ahead will be purely one thing or the other. Very few will be entirely thoughtless mockery with no self-awareness whatsoever, and very few will be entirely sharp-pointed satire with no reduction of the group being depicted. Most of them, much like Cleveland's overall portrayal, will contain some mixture of both approaches sitting side by side, sometimes within the very same episode or even the very same scene. Recognizing this mixture, rather than flattening every example into a single simple judgment, is part of what separates a careful examination of this subject from a surface-level list of offensive moments pulled without context. The golf course scene in particular deserves to be remembered as one of the clearest examples across the entire history of the show of a joke that names its target directly, rather than hiding behind exaggeration or implication. Most of the jokes discussed so far in this video, and many of the jokes still ahead in later sections, work by relying on stereotype and exaggeration to get their laugh, requiring the audience to already hold certain assumptions about a group in order for the joke to land at all. The golf course scene works differently. It does not require the audience to already believe anything negative about black golfers. Instead, it stages a very specific, historically grounded form of discrimination and lets the absurdity of that discrimination speak for itself, with Cleveland serving as the calm, dignified center of a scene built to expose prejudice rather than reinforce it. This makes it one of the more genuinely effective pieces of satire connected to race anywhere in the show's long run, even while it exists inside the same series that also gave the world Ollie Williams and his short, shouted forecasts. Family Guy's writers have talked in various interviews and public statements about the general philosophy behind their approach to controversial humor, often describing their intention as treating every group equally by making fun of everyone without exception. The golf course scene and the Ollie Williams format, sitting inside the same show, applied to characters of the same race but built through completely different comedic methods, shows how complicated that stated philosophy becomes once it actually reaches the screen. Treating every group equally does not automatically mean treating every joke about every group the same way. Some jokes expose prejudice. Some jokes reduce the very people they claim to represent. Cleveland Brown, more than almost any other character discussed in this video, sits at the exact center of that tension, carrying both approaches inside a single, ongoing character across more than 2 decades of television. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Sitting alongside Cleveland at that same drunken clam bar table for most of the show's run is a reporter with a completely different kind of ethnic coding built into her character. One built less around accent or workplace discrimination and more around a specific set of ideas about intelligence, emotion, and family expectation. And that reporter's story deserves its own full examination next. Section 3. The Asian Community. Trisha Takanawa and the Model Minority Circuit. Trisha Takanawa, briefly introduced back in the first section of this video as part of the news desk format, deserves her own closer look because the jokes built around her and around Asian characters more broadly on this show follow a different set of ideas entirely. Where Cleveland's comedy leans on voice and accent, and where Ollie Williams leans on volume and brevity, the humor surrounding Asian characters on Family Guy leans heavily on a specific set of assumptions about intelligence, academic achievement, and family discipline. A cluster of ideas often referred to by researchers and critics as the model minority stereotype. Understanding how that particular stereotype shows up across the show requires looking beyond Trisha alone and into a handful of smaller jokes scattered across many different episodes, each one drawing from the same well of assumptions about what Asian people are supposed to be good at and what they are supposed to lack. The model minority idea, in simple terms, is the belief that Asian Americans as a group are unusually intelligent, unusually hardworking, unusually incredibly successful in school and business, and in exchange for all of that success, somehow lacking in other areas, usually social skills, athletic ability, or romantic appeal. This belief has a long history in American culture, stretching back decades before Family Guy ever aired its first episode, showing up across many different movies, television shows, and news stories long before it became a specific target for this particular cartoon. Family Guy did not invent this stereotype any more than it invented the accent joke used for Cleveland. It picked up an existing and widely recognized cultural assumption and folded it directly into several of its cutaway gags, the short, unrelated scenes the show frequently uses to interrupt its main plot for a quick joke unrelated to whatever the characters are currently doing. One of the clearest examples of this pattern appears in a brief cutaway gag involving Peter Griffin taking a standardized test similar to the SAT, the college entrance exam widely used across American high schools. In the joke, Peter needs a calculator during the test and simply pulls an Asian boy out of his bag to use in place of an actual calculator, treating the child as a stand-in for a piece of math equipment purely because of his race. This joke works entirely because it assumes the audience already carries a specific belief in their head before the joke even starts, namely, the idea that Asian people are naturally gifted at mathematics simply because of their ethnic background. The joke does not build any actual scenario or situation. It exists purely as a quick visual gag that only makes sense if the viewer already holds this specific stereotype as a shared cultural assumption. This is a useful example to examine closely because it shows a different comedic method than anything discussed in the first 2 sections of this video. Cleveland's accent joke requires a voice performance built over time across dozens of appearances. The golf course scene requires an entire short story with a setup and a payoff. This SAT joke requires nothing beyond a single visual image and a shared cultural stereotype sitting in the back of the audience's mind, delivered and gone within a few seconds. This same underlying assumption about academic ability connects to a second related stereotype that frequently travels alongside it. The idea that Asian men in particular lack romantic or sexual appeal compared to men from other backgrounds. This stereotype has also been studied and discussed extensively by researchers looking at how Asian men are represented across American film and television, often noting a pattern where Asian male characters are given intelligence and academic success but denied romantic storylines, physical confidence, or any sense of being desired by other characters. Family Guy engages with this particular stereotype in a slightly more complicated way than it engages with the calculator joke, because in at least one storyline, the show actually works against the stereotype, rather than repeating it directly. In one storyline, Meg Griffin, the oldest child in the Griffin family, becomes romantically interested in an Asian male character, and the show treats this attraction as genuine, rather than treating it as a joke about her lowered standards or his supposed lack of appeal. This moment stands out because it goes against the exact pattern the SAT joke reinforces just a few scenes or a few episodes away, creating a strange and somewhat contradictory picture where the show is capable of both repeating a stereotype and gently pushing back against that same stereotype, using different characters at different points across its long run. This contradiction is worth sitting with carefully rather than resolving too quickly in either direction. It would be inaccurate to say that Family Guy simply repeats every negative assumption about Asian people without any variation at all, since the Meg storyline shows a moment where the show actively works against one of the most common stereotypes about Asian men and romance. It would be equally inaccurate to say that the show generally treats Asian characters with care and nuance, since the calculator joke and several other similar cutaways rely entirely on assumptions the show never bothers to question or complicate in any way. The truth sitting between these two positions is that Family Guy's writers, across more than 2 decades of episodes written by many different people, did not appear to follow one single consistent approach toward Asian characters. Some jokes reinforce old assumptions actions without any apparent awareness that they are doing so. Other moments, even if brief and easy to miss, quietly work against those same assumptions. Both things exist inside the same body of work, sometimes separated by many years and many different writers who likely never discussed the earlier joke when writing the later one. Returning to Trisha Takanawa specifically, since her character carries the largest and most consistent presence of any Asian character across the entire run of the show, it becomes clear how many of these different threads intersect inside a single ongoing role. Her professional competence connects to the model minority idea of academic and career success, since she holds a visible, respected position as a television reporter, despite the show constantly labeling her by her ethnicity rather than her job title. Her family life connects to a different but related stereotype, the idea of the unusually strict and demanding Asian parent, represented through her mother Irene, who the show writes as harsh, critical, and emotionally distant toward her daughter across the handful of episodes where the two characters appear together, and her occasional moments of sudden, exaggerated desire, including the previously mentioned scene involving the musician David Bowie, connect back to a very different and almost contradictory stereotype about repressed emotion suddenly breaking free in an exaggerated way, playing against the otherwise calm and professional image the character maintains during her regular reporting segments. What makes Trisha a genuinely interesting case study, more so than many other side characters discussed across this video, is that these different stereotypes do not always sit comfortably together. The model minority idea generally suggests someone who is reserved, controlled, and unemotional. The sudden romantic outburst suggests the opposite, an emotional intensity hiding just beneath a controlled surface, ready to burst out the moment the right trigger appears. A character built entirely around consistent, careful stereotyping would likely pick one of these ideas and stick with it. Trisha instead seems to carry pieces of several different and sometimes contradictory stereotypes about Asian people, layered onto a single character who otherwise functions as a fairly minor, recurring piece of the show's larger ensemble cast. This suggests that the writers were drawing from a general cultural pool of Asian stereotypes whenever they needed a quick joke involving her character, rather than building her around one single, carefully considered idea from the very beginning. There is also the matter of accent and speech pattern, which connects this section back directly to the accent discussion covered in the previous section about Cleveland Brown. Family Guy has used exaggerated Asian accents in various background characters and cutaway gags across its run, following a similar comedic method to Cleveland's altered pronunciation, but applied more inconsistently and spread across many different minor, one-time characters, rather than concentrated inside a single ongoing main character the way it is with Cleveland. This means the accent joke shows up less predictably when discussing Asian characters on the show, appearing suddenly in one episode and then disappearing for long stretches before reappearing again in a completely different context with a completely different character. Trisha herself is generally not given an exaggerated accent, since her voice actor, Alex Borstein, plays her with a calm, standard American delivery, rather than any kind of accent-based comedy. This means the accent joke and the Trisha character exist somewhat separately from each other inside the show's overall treatment of Asian characters. Another small example of how inconsistent the show's approach becomes once it is examined piece by piece rather than treated as a single, unified pattern. Placing all of this next to what was already covered about the news desk format in the first section of this video builds a fuller picture of how Trisha Takanawa functions across the entire series. She is constantly labeled by her ethnicity every time she appears on screen, a pattern discussed at length earlier in this video. She carries pieces of the model minority stereotype through her professional competence and her strict mother. She occasionally becomes the subject of jokes about hidden, exaggerated desire breaking through her calm exterior, and she exists inside a show that, through a completely separate storyline involving Meg Griffin, is also capable of working against at least one closely related stereotype about Asian romantic appeal, even while reinforcing several others through Trisha's own character just a few episodes away. No single one of these elements fully explains how the show handles Asian characters. All of them together, layered on top of each other across more than 20 years of episodes, come much closer to an accurate and complete picture. One additional detail worth including here, since it speaks directly to how the show's writers seem to think about the character over time, involves Trisha's professional standing compared to her white colleagues at the news station. Despite being constantly reduced to her ethnic label every time she is introduced, Trisha is also shown handling a wide range of difficult and even dangerous assignments throughout the show's run, reporting live from hurricanes, disaster scenes, and various chaotic events happening around Quahog. In several of these moments, she demonstrates more composure and professionalism than her fellow anchors Tom Tucker and Diane Simmons, who are frequently written as vain, self-absorbed, and prone to breaking down under pressure or getting distracted by their own personal drama in the middle of a broadcast. This creates an interesting imbalance, where Trisha, despite receiving less individual character development and being constantly reduced to a racial label, often comes across as more competent and more reliable than the white characters positioned above her in the newsroom hierarchy. Whether this imbalance was an intentional choice by the writers or simply a side effect of how the joke format around Tom and Diane happened to be built is difficult to say for certain, but the pattern itself is consistent enough across many different episodes to be worth noting as part of a complete picture of her character. Taken together, the picture that emerges from examining Trisha Takanawa and the broader collection of Asian-focused jokes scattered across Family Guy looks quite different from the picture that emerged from examining Cleveland Brown in the previous section. Cleveland's comedy centers heavily on one specific consistent device, his altered pronunciation, applied steadily across more than 2 decades of appearances. The Asian-focused humor on this show is more scattered, pulling from several different and sometimes contradictory stereotypes, rather than settling on one single consistent joke applied to one single character. This difference matters because it shows that Family Guy does not appear to have a single unified method for handling race across every group it depicts. Each group seems to get its own particular set of assumptions, drawn from whatever cultural stereotypes already existed around that group before the show ever started, applied in whatever way seemed to fit the joke a particular writer wanted to tell in a particular episode, often without much apparent coordination between one episode and the next. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This lack of a single unified approach becomes especially clear once the video moves into its next section, which shifts away from side characters and background jokes entirely and looks instead at one of the only storylines in the entire history of the show built around the Griffin family's own patriarch discovering that his own identity is not what he always assumed it to be. Section 4. Mexican and Latino immigrants. Peter discovers he is undocumented. This section shifts to something different, a full storyline built entirely around one of the show's own main characters, Peter Griffin himself, and how his identity as an American citizen gets pulled apart and rebuilt across a single episode called Padre de Familia. This episode matters for a very specific reason. Unlike Trisha Takanawa or Ollie Williams, who are given a handful of seconds per episode spread out across the entire series, this storyline dedicates an entire 22 minutes to a single ethnic group, using Peter's own family as the direct vehicle for the joke, rather than placing that joke onto a background character who exists mainly to be laughed at from a distance. The episode begins with Peter in an entirely different frame of mind than the one he ends up in by the time the story concludes. At the start of Padre de Familia, Peter becomes consumed with a strong dislike of illegal immigrants living in his town of Quahog, believing they are taking away jobs that should belong to American citizens like himself. This sets up the central irony the entire episode is built around, since Peter has no idea at this point in the story that his own background is about to be revealed as something completely different from what he has always assumed. Peter goes out of his way during this early part of the episode to make life difficult for immigrant workers around him, including convincing his workplace supervisor at the brewery where he works to run an inspection specifically designed to find and remove any employees who cannot prove their citizenship. citizenship. This section of the episode plays Peter's behavior as loud, aggressive, and increasingly extreme, following a pattern the show often uses with its lead character, where Peter commits fully and dramatically to whatever new belief or obsession has taken hold of him that week, regardless of how much damage it causes to the people around him. The turning point of the episode arrives when Peter needs to provide his own birth certificate as proof of his citizenship, since his earlier crusade against illegal immigrants at his workplace eventually creates a situation where he himself is asked to prove his own legal status. When he visits his mother Thelma to retrieve this document, she reveals a secret about his birth that changes the entire direction of the story. According to Thelma, she became pregnant with Peter after an affair with an Irishman who was frequently drunk, and upon discovering the pregnancy, she traveled to Mexico with the intention of ending it. However, during that visit, she ended up giving birth to Peter in Mexico instead of following through with her original plan. And after his birth, she found that she loved him and decided to bring him back home with her to the United States. Because of the private and complicated nature of these circumstances, she never filed the paperwork needed to formally register Peter as an American citizen, which means that, according to the rules laid out inside the episode, Peter himself has technically been living as an undocumented Mexican immigrant his entire life without ever knowing it. This reveal creates an immediate and dramatic reversal in Peter's own situation. Because he cannot produce a valid birth certificate proving his citizenship, Peter loses his job at the brewery, the very same job he had just used to target other immigrant workers only a short time earlier in the episode. His financial situation collapses quickly, and his wife Lois suggests that he attempt to take an official naturalization test, the same kind of test any immigrant seeking American citizenship would need to complete. Peter fails this test, and the episode goes further by raising a question about whether his 20-year marriage to Lois is even legally valid at all, given the uncertainty now surrounding his actual citizenship status. Unable to find other stable work, Peter eventually turns to Lois's wealthy father Carter for help, and Carter agrees to give him work as a servant on his large estate, a job that places Peter directly alongside a group of other immigrant workers living and laboring on the same property. This section of the episode is where the story takes its most direct turn toward examining the actual immigrant experience Peter had been mocking and attacking only a short time earlier. Working under Carter, who is written throughout the show as a wealthy, arrogant, and often cruel businessman, Peter begins to experience firsthand the difficult and exhausting conditions faced by the other immigrant laborers around him. Through this shared hardship, he begins forming genuine friendships with the workers he had previously viewed with suspicion and hostility. And this new perspective shifts significantly by the time the workers invite him and his family to join their celebration for Cinco de Mayo, a Mexican holiday commemorating a historical military victory. The episode uses this celebration scene as a moment of connection and shared joy, showing Peter fully participating in the festivities alongside people he had spent the earlier part of the episode trying to remove from his community entirely. The story reaches its final turn when Carter, unable to tolerate the presence of a large gathering of immigrant workers celebrating on his property, interrupts the Cinco de Mayo party by reminding everyone present about official immigration regulations, effectively shutting down the celebration through the threat of legal consequences. This action from Carter angers Peter enough that he organizes the other workers into a form of protest or rebellion against Carter's treatment of them. Faced with this organized pushback, Carter eventually offers Peter a deal, agreeing to grant him official American citizenship in exchange for Peter calling off the rebellion and ending the unrest among the workers. Peter initially insists that every worker involved should receive the same citizenship opportunity being offered to him alone, refusing to accept special treatment for himself while leaving everyone else behind in the same difficult situation they started in. However, the other workers convince him to accept Carter's offer for himself, telling him that their own opportunity for citizenship will eventually come in its own time, and the episode concludes with Peter's citizenship restored, while the broader immigration situation faced by his newfound friends remains largely unresolved. Looking at the structure of this entire storyline reveals something worth examining closely, especially when compared against the earlier sections of this video, covering Cleveland Brown and Tricia Takanawa. Both of those earlier examples involved side characters who exist mainly to deliver quick jokes built around fixed traits like accent or academic stereotype, repeated consistently across many different episodes without much change or development. Padre de Familia works differently because its entire comedic engine depends on change and reversal rather than repetition. The joke is not that Mexican immigrants are funny because of some fixed trait assigned to them. The joke is built around Peter's own hypocrisy, following him from a position of aggressive hostility toward immigrants at the start of the episode to a position of genuine friendship and shared struggle alongside immigrants by the episode's end, all triggered by the discovery that he was one of them the entire time without ever realizing it. This particular structure places the joke's weight in a very different location than the jokes discussed in the first 3 sections of this video. Rather than mocking Mexican immigrants directly through exaggeration or stereotype, the episode instead mocks Peter's own ignorance and his willingness to hold strong, aggressive opinions about a group of people he knew almost nothing about, including apparently very little about his own family history. The actual immigrant characters working alongside Peter on Carter's estate are generally written with more sympathy and more dignity than Peter himself receives during the earlier parts of the episode, shown working hard under difficult conditions, welcoming Peter into their community despite his earlier hostility toward people like them, and ultimately displaying more generosity toward him than he initially showed toward people in their situation. At the same time, it would be inaccurate to present this episode as entirely free of stereotype or exaggeration, simply because its main satirical target is Peter's hypocrisy rather than the immigrants themselves. The episode still leans on a number of familiar comedic shortcuts throughout its runtime, including exaggerated portrayals of the living conditions faced by the workers on Carter's estate, and a generally simplified version of what daily immigrant labor and immigrant community life actually looks like in reality. The Cinco de Mayo celebration scene, while framed positively within the story, still relies on a somewhat surface-level and stereotypical version of the holiday's traditions and imagery, rather than engaging with the holiday's actual historical origins or its more complicated relationship to Mexican and Mexican-American identity and celebration. This means the episode manages to be more sympathetic in its overall structure than many of the jokes discussed earlier in this video, while still falling back on familiar shortcuts and simplified imagery whenever it needs to visually represent Mexican culture on screen. There is also a legal detail worth mentioning here, since it affects how accurately the entire premise of the episode actually reflects real immigration law, even within the exaggerated and comedic world the show usually operates inside. Under real United States citizenship law, a child born to at least one parent who holds American citizenship, regardless of where in the world that child is physically born, generally qualifies for American citizenship at birth in most circumstances, meaning the central legal crisis driving the entire episode would likely not hold up as an accurate depiction of how citizenship actually works in reality. Since Thelma was already an American citizen prior to giving birth to Peter, most real-world interpretations of citizenship law would grant Peter citizenship through his mother, regardless of the fact that he happened to be born on Mexican soil rather than American soil. The episode does not address this legal detail, choosing instead to treat Peter's foreign birth as an automatic disqualification from citizenship in order to keep the story's premise moving forward. This is worth pointing out clearly because it shows that Padre de Familia prioritizes its comedic premise over legal accuracy, something that becomes an important detail to keep in mind when discussing how realistically or unrealistically the show chooses to depict immigration and citizenship throughout this particular storyline. Placing Padre de Familia next to everything already discussed earlier in this video creates an interesting contrast worth carrying forward. Cleveland Brown's comedy depends on a fixed trait repeated consistently over time. Trisha Takanawa's comedy depends on a scattered collection of assumptions pulled from a broader cultural stereotype about an entire ethnic group. Padre de Familia depends on neither of these methods, instead building its entire comedic structure around reversal, hypocrisy, and a full character journey compressed into a single episode. This shows that Family Guy does not rely on just one single formula when building jokes connected to race and ethnicity. Sometimes the show reduces a group through repeated exaggeration spread across many episodes. Other times, as seen here, the show builds an entire standalone story designed to expose the ignorance of one of its own main characters, rather than the group he initially holds prejudice against. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This same subject, Mexican and broader Latino immigration, returns again later in the show's run through a completely different storyline built around a different member of the Griffin family entirely, told through a much more sentimental and emotionally driven approach, rather than the reversal-based comedy found inside Padre de Familia. That second storyline, involving Peter's teenage son Chris and a romantic relationship that leads the entire Griffin family across the southern border in a much more serious and dramatic fashion, deserves close examination immediately next. Section 5, Mexican and Latino Immigrants, Part 2, Dearly Deported and the Border Storyline. The previous section looked at Padre de Familia and showed how Family Guy built an entire episode around Peter Griffin's own hypocrisy, using his discovery of his own Mexican birth to flip his hostility toward immigrants into genuine friendship and shared experience. Nearly a decade later, the show returned to the same general subject of Mexican immigration through a completely different storyline, told through a completely different character, and built around a completely different emotional tone. This second storyline appears in the episode Dearly Deported, which aired as part of the show's 14th season, and it centers not on Peter, but on his teenage son Chris, following a romantic relationship that eventually pulls the entire Griffin family across the southern border into Mexico itself. Comparing this episode directly against Padre de Familia reveals how much the show's approach to the same general topic can shift over time, even while some of the same comedic habits and shortcuts remain firmly in place. The episode begins with Chris Griffin falling for a young woman named Isabella during a family trip to a water park, where their initial meeting starts with Chris taking her swimsuit top without permission, a moment played for comedy rather than treated with any seriousness. Despite this awkward and somewhat inappropriate beginning, Isabella ends up going on a date with Chris after Stewie, his younger brother, encourages him to pursue her. The relationship develops further once Chris and his family learn that Isabella already has 2 young twin sons. And while Lois and other family members initially express some hesitation about this detail, the show generally treats Isabella herself with warmth and sympathy throughout the episode, positioning her as a genuine and likable character rather than as the target of any joke connected specifically to her identity or background. The central crisis of the episode arrives when Isabella reveals that she is going to be deported, forcing her to leave the country and return to Mexico while her situation with her immigration status gets sorted out. Before leaving, she asks Chris to take care of her 2 young sons until she is able to return, and Chris agrees to this responsibility despite his young age and obvious lack of experience raising children. What follows is a fairly extended sequence showing Chris struggling to manage the basic tasks of caring for 2 young children, including scenes depicting his confusion over feeding routines and his general unpreparedness for the responsibility he has taken on. This section of the episode plays mostly as a straightforward parenting comedy, following a familiar structure many television shows use whenever an inexperienced character suddenly finds themselves responsible for young children, without much direct connection to the immigration storyline running alongside it. The story shifts into a more serious tone once word arrives that Isabella will not be able to return to the United States after all, prompting Lois to insist that the family cannot simply keep the children separated from their mother indefinitely. Rather than allowing Chris to give up his education and take a job to support the children long term, Lois makes the decision that the family should travel to Mexico themselves in order to reunite the boys with their mother. This decision leads the entire Griffin family, including Peter, Lois, Chris, and the two children, on a journey south across the border, ultimately arriving in Isabella's home village, which the show names Santa Terrible inside the episode. Once there, the family finds Isabella living in a community described within the episode as crime-ridden and difficult, and Lois once again steps forward as the primary decision-maker, working out a plan to help smuggle Isabella and her children back into the United States. This plan to smuggle Isabella back across the border becomes the setup for one of the episode's more dramatic sequences, in which the family calls on Glenn Quagmire, Peter's friend and neighbor who works as an airline pilot, to fly a plane down to meet them so they can transport Isabella and the children out of the country together. Before this plan can be carried out, however, the family runs into a group of corrupt Mexican police officers while traveling through the desert. Rather than arresting the family or Isabella for what would technically be an attempt at illegal border crossing, these officers instead choose to steal the family's plane and their vehicle, leaving the entire group stranded in the desert without transportation. This particular sequence draws directly on a stereotype about corruption inside Mexican law enforcement, a stereotype that shows up frequently across American media and popular culture, and the episode leans into this stereotype without much additional context or nuance, treating police corruption in Mexico as an assumed and unquestioned fact of the story's setting, rather than something the episode takes time to explore or complicate. This scene also includes a specific piece of dialogue worth examining directly, since it connects the episode to a broader political conversation that was happening in the real world at the exact time the episode originally aired. After witnessing the corrupt officers steal their belongings, Chris expresses surprise that corrupt police officers would exist in Mexico at all, and Peter responds by referencing Donald Trump, stating that Trump had apparently been right about something related to this exact situation. This line appears to reference public comments Trump had made about Mexican immigrants and crime during his campaign for president, comments that had generated significant public debate and controversy at the time. The episode inserts this reference briefly and moves on quickly without exploring the topic any further, treating it as a passing joke rather than a serious political statement. Though the placement of the joke directly beside a scene depicting corrupt Mexican police does create a moment where the show appears to be reinforcing, at least briefly, one of the exact stereotypes connected to that same political conversation happening in the real world at the time. Stranded in the desert, following the theft of their vehicle and plane, the Griffin family faces a genuinely dangerous situation when they are attacked by a group of wild coyotes. During this attack, Chris makes the decision to allow himself to be bitten severely by the animals in order to protect the two young children he has been caring for throughout the episode, taking on significant physical harm himself rather than allowing the twins to be hurt. This moment is treated with more seriousness and more emotional weight than most other scenes in the episode, marking a clear turning point in how Lois views her son's maturity and his ability to handle real responsibility. Witnessing Chris's willingness to sacrifice his own safety for the sake of two children who are not biologically his own leads Lois to reconsider her earlier doubts about his readiness to take on this kind of responsibility, giving the episode a genuine emotional payoff built around Chris's personal growth rather than around any joke connected to race or immigration specifically. Looking at the overall balance of this episode reveals a mixture fairly similar to what was already discussed in the previous section covering Padre de Familia, though arranged somewhat differently. Isabella herself is written with clear sympathy throughout the episode, treated as a genuine romantic interest for Chris, rather than as a source of jokes connected to her ethnicity or her immigration status. Her situation, including her deportation and her separation from her children, is generally treated with a level of emotional seriousness that stands in contrast to some of the broader, more exaggerated jokes found elsewhere in the show's history covering similar topics. At the same time, the episode still leans on specific stereotypes when it needs to quickly establish the setting and atmosphere of Isabella's home village in Mexico, including the depiction of widespread crime and the corrupt police officers who steal from the family without consequence. These two elements exist side by side inside the same 22-minute episode, meaning that a full and accurate account of Dearly Deported has to acknowledge both the genuine sympathy given to Isabella and her personal story, alongside the broader stereotypes used to construct the setting and side characters surrounding her. Comparing this episode directly against Padre de Familia highlights an important shift in how the show approached the same general subject matter roughly a decade apart. Padre de Familia built its entire structure around Peter's hypocrisy and his personal transformation from hostility toward immigrants to genuine solidarity with them, using comedy and reversal as its primary tools throughout. Dearly Deported instead builds its structure around a genuine romantic relationship and a family's collective effort to reunite a mother with her children, using emotional stakes and sincerity as its primary tools, rather than comedic reversal. This difference in approach suggests that the writers responsible for Dearly Deported were, at least in this particular episode, attempting something closer to a heartfelt family story layered on top of the show's usual format of quick jokes and cutaway gags, rather than building the entire episode around comedy the way Padre de Familia does from beginning to end. However, attempting a more sincere and emotionally driven story does not automatically mean the episode avoids all of the same comedic shortcuts the show typically relies on whenever it needs to depict a culture or a setting outside of its usual small-town New England backdrop of Quahog. The naming of Isabella's village as Santa Terrible, a name clearly designed to sound both authentically Spanish and comedically exaggerated at the same time, shows that even in its more sincere moments, the show still reaches for quick jokes rather than carefully researched or respectful details when constructing the world surrounding its Latino characters. Similarly, the corrupt police officers who steal from the family without any real consequence or explanation function primarily as a plot device to strand the family in the desert, built more around an existing stereotype about Mexican law enforcement than around any specific detail unique to the story being told. There is also a detail worth mentioning connected to a separate animated series that had aired on the same network not long before Dearly Deported. According to information published about the episode, a significant portion of the storyline overlaps with elements originally developed for a short-lived animated show called Border Town, which had been created for the same network and had been canceled after receiving poor reviews from critics. This connection suggests that at least some of the specific plot elements and character details used inside Dearly Deported may have originated from material originally written for that separate, canceled series, rather than being developed entirely from scratch specifically for Family Guy. This detail is worth including because it shows that some of the specific choices made inside this particular episode may reflect decisions made by an entirely different creative team working on a different project, rather than reflecting a decision made directly and independently by the regular Family Guy writing staff. Placing this episode alongside everything already covered earlier in this video about Mexican immigration inside the show's history reveals a pattern worth carrying forward into the remainder of this examination. Family Guy returned to this exact subject twice across a span of roughly 10 years, and each time it approached the subject through a completely different storytelling method, using Peter's personal hypocrisy the first time and Chris's romantic relationship and personal growth the second time. Despite these different approaches, both episodes ultimately rely on some of the same underlying stereotypes when it comes time to depict Mexican culture and Mexican settings specifically, whether through the simplified Cinco de Mayo celebration immigration, seen in the earlier episode, or through the corrupt police officers and dangerous desert village, seen in this one. This suggests that while the show is capable of changing its comedic structure and its emotional tone significantly from one episode to the next, the underlying well of stereotypes it draws from when depicting a specific culture tends to remain fairly consistent across many years and many different writers, even when the overall story being told around those stereotypes changes considerably. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This same tension between genuine sympathy for an individual character and reliance on broader cultural stereotype for the surrounding setting becomes even more pronounced in the next storyline this video will examine, which shifts away from Mexican and Latino immigration entirely and moves instead into an episode built specifically around Peter's search for financial help from within Quahog's Jewish community, an episode that Fox found troubling enough to hold off the air entirely for a period of several years before it was ever broadcast to the public. Section 6. Jewish Stereotypes. The Weinstein episode Fox would not air. Family Guy has told plenty of jokes that generated angry letters and public criticism after they aired. This episode is different. It stands as one of the clearest examples in the show's entire history of a network stepping in and holding an episode back from broadcast entirely, not because of audience backlash after the fact, but because of concerns raised before it ever reached a television screen. That episode is called When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, and its production and broadcast history says almost as much about the show's relationship with controversial material as the actual content of the episode itself. The episode comes from the third season of the show, and its plot follows Peter Griffin as he struggles with his family's finances, eventually landing on the idea that hiring a Jewish person to manage his money will solve his financial problems. This premise comes directly from an old and widely recognized stereotype, claiming that Jewish people possess a natural talent for handling money, a stereotype with a long and well-documented history stretching back many centuries in various parts of the world, often tied to anti-Semitic ideas that treat Jewish people as inherently obsessed with wealth or unusually skilled at financial manipulation, regardless of their individual personality or profession. Peter's search for someone to fit this description eventually leads him to a character named Max Weinstein, and the two form a friendship over the course of the episode, with Weinstein ultimately helping Peter improve his financial situation in a way that reinforces the exact stereotype that drove Peter to seek him out in the first place. The episode does not stop at Peter's own storyline. As his friendship with Max Weinstein develops, Peter becomes increasingly convinced that being Jewish is directly connected to financial and personal success, and this belief leads him to encourage his teenage son Chris to convert to Judaism, based on the assumption that doing so will automatically improve Chris's own chances at succeeding in life. This part of the plot extends the episode's central stereotype even further, applying it not just to a single adult side character, but to the idea of Jewish identity itself, treating it as something that functions almost like a guaranteed formula for success rather than a religious and cultural identity with its own independent meaning separate from wealth or achievement. The episode includes a musical number built around this same idea, structured as a parody of the well-known song When You Wish Upon a Star, with new lyrics built entirely around stereotypes connecting Jewish identity to money and financial success. What makes this episode stand apart from most other examples covered elsewhere in this video is what happened after it was finished, but before it ever reached the public. According to the show's own broadcast history, Fox made the decision not to air this episode when it was originally scheduled to appear during the show's third season. The network's stated concern centered on the risk of significant backlash from audiences and advocacy groups over the episode's handling of Jewish stereotypes, a concern serious enough that the network chose to pull the episode from its planned broadcast schedule entirely rather than risk airing it and dealing with the consequences afterward. This is a meaningfully different situation than most of the other controversies discussed throughout this video, since in nearly every other case examined so far, the show aired the material first, and any public criticism criticism followed only after audiences had already seen it. Here, the network made its decision in advance, based on an assessment of the material before a single viewer outside of the production process had the chance to see it. The episode did not disappear permanently, however. After being pulled from its original broadcast slot, When You Wish Upon a Weinstein eventually found its way to audiences through a home video release, appearing on DVD roughly 3 years after it was originally produced. This means the episode existed in a strange in-between state for a significant stretch of time, fully completed and ready for broadcast, acknowledged as part of the show's official episode catalog, and yet withheld from actual television audiences because of concerns about its content. Viewers who wanted to see the episode during those 3 years had no way to do so through regular television broadcast, and the episode only became available to a wider audience once the DVD release made it accessible outside of the normal weekly airing schedule. The rest of the show followed. Looking closely at why this particular episode triggered this level of caution from the network compared to many other controversial episodes that aired without this kind of delay, requires looking at the specific historical weight carried by stereotypes connecting Jewish people to money and financial control. This particular stereotype has a documented history stretching back centuries, tied at various points to real and serious persecution of Jewish communities across different countries and different eras, including its use as a justification for discrimination and violence during some of the darkest periods in European history. Because of this specific historical weight, jokes connecting Jewish identity to money carry a different kind of risk compared to many of the other stereotypes discussed throughout this video, since this particular idea has a long, documented connection to real-world harm, rather than existing purely as a modern comedic shorthand with a more recent and less severe history behind it. This historical weight likely explains why Fox treated this particular episode differently than it treated many of the other examples covered across this video, several of which aired without any similar delay, despite containing material that also generated significant criticism after broadcast. The specific stereotype at the center of this episode, connecting an entire religious and ethnic group to greed and financial manipulation, carries a documented history of being used to justify real persecution in a way that many of the show's other stereotypes, however reductive or inaccurate they may be, generally do not carry to the same degree. This does not mean the other stereotypes discussed elsewhere in this video are harmless by comparison, but it does help explain why a network already known for allowing Family Guy significant creative freedom chose to intervene specifically in this case before the episode ever reached the public. It is worth examining the character of Max Weinstein himself a bit further, since his portrayal inside the episode carries some of the same internal contradiction discussed in earlier examinations of other side characters throughout this video. Weinstein is written as a genuinely kind and helpful figure throughout his appearances, offering real friendship to Peter and real practical help with his financial troubles, rather than being written as cold, greedy, or manipulative himself. In this sense, his individual personality pushes somewhat against the harsher version of the stereotype the episode is built around, since he is not personally depicted as obsessed with money or scheming in any way. However, his function inside the plot still exists entirely to prove the stereotype correct at a structural level, since the entire premise of the episode depends on his identity as a Jewish character being the reason he is able to help Peter with his finances in the first place. This creates a similar situation to what was already seen with other characters discussed throughout this video, where an individual character can be written with warmth and likability, while the underlying structure of the jokes surrounding that character still reinforces the exact stereotype the character's personality seems to be pushing against. The Chris conversion storyline adds another layer worth examining specifically specifically, since it extends the episode's central idea beyond a single character and applies it to an entire religious identity treated as something that can simply be adopted for practical benefit. Religious conversion in reality is generally understood as a deeply personal process connected to genuine belief, community, and identity, developed over significant time and reflection rather than treated as a quick decision made for financial advantage. The episode strips away all of this complexity, treating Chris's conversion as a simple transaction driven entirely by Peter's belief that Jewish identity functions as a kind of guaranteed shortcut to success. This treatment reduces an entire religious tradition to a single stereotype about financial ability, ignoring every other aspect of Jewish religious and cultural identity in favor of the one narrow idea the episode's comedy depends on. Comparing the eventual public reaction to this episode against its unusual broadcast history reveals an interesting detail about how audiences and critics received the material once it finally became available. Even arriving 3 years later and only through home video rather than regular broadcast, the episode still generated significant discussion and criticism once viewers were able to see it, with commentators specifically pointing to the episode as one of the clearest examples of the show engaging directly with anti-Semitic stereotypes, rather than simply brushing against the subject briefly through a passing joke. This suggests that Fox's original concern about the episode's content, serious enough to delay its broadcast for years, was not unfounded once the material actually reached its intended audience, since the same concerns the network anticipated in advance were largely echoed by critics and viewers once they finally had the chance to watch the finished episode for themselves. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Fox allowed an enormous range of controversial material onto the air over the following 2 decades, without ever stepping in like this again. A different religious community becomes the target of a much later episode, one that aired exactly on schedule and later collided with a real tragedy through nothing more than unfortunate timing. Section 7. Muslim and Middle Eastern Communities, Turban Cowboy and its Timing. The Weinstein episode showed a rare case where the network itself stepped in before broadcast, holding material back because of concerns raised in advance. This section examines a completely different kind of controversy, one where the episode aired exactly on schedule, with no advance intervention from the network at all, and where the real controversy only developed after broadcast because of a tragic and unplanned coincidence between the episode's content and a real-world event happening at almost the exact same time. That episode is called Turban Cowboy, and it stands as one of the clearest examples across the entire history of the show of how timing alone can turn an already controversial episode into something far more difficult to defend. Turban Cowboy comes from the 11th season of the show, and its plot follows Peter Griffin after he ends up in the hospital following an accident in Las Vegas. During his hospital stay, he befriends a Muslim man named Mahmoud, and the two form a genuine friendship over the course of their recovery. This friendship leads Peter to attend a social gathering with Mahmoud after they are both released from the hospital, where he is introduced to various aspects of Islamic culture and tradition for the first time. What begins as a fairly ordinary storyline about Peter learning about a culture he knows little about takes a sudden and dramatic turn when the gathering he attends turns out to actually be a meeting of a group of men planning to carry out a bombing attack targeting a bridge in the area. Peter, who had no idea about the true nature of the gathering when he agreed to attend, becomes entangled in the plot without fully understanding what he has walked into, and as the plan to carry out the bombing accelerates throughout the episode, his own friends and family begin to grow suspicious that Peter himself may be personally involved in the plot. The episode reaches its climax with Peter realizing the full scope of what is actually happening around him, prompting a frantic effort to escape the area before the bomb attached to the bridge is set off. Looking closely at the plot structure alone, separate from any outside context surrounding its broadcast, this storyline draws directly on one of the most widely discussed and most frequently criticized stereotypes connected to Muslim communities in American media. The assumption that Muslim gatherings and Muslim religious or cultural spaces are inherently connected to terrorism and violent extremism. This stereotype has been the subject of extensive criticism from Muslim advocacy organizations and media researchers for many years, particularly given how frequently American film and television have used Muslim characters primarily as stand-ins for terrorist threats, rather than as fully developed individuals with lives, families, and concerns unrelated to violence. Turban Cowboy places this exact stereotype at the very center of its plot, using it as the engine that drives the entire episode, from its early, more light-hearted friendship storyline all the way through to its more frantic and action-driven conclusion. The episode's approach to Mahmoud as an individual character is worth examining separately from the broader terrorism plot surrounding him, since the two elements do not necessarily align with each other in a completely consistent way. Mahmoud himself, at least in the portions of the episode focused on his friendship with Peter, is generally written as warm, welcoming, and genuinely interested in sharing his culture and traditions with someone unfamiliar with them. The friendship between the two men develops with a level of sincerity that echoes some of the same patterns already discussed earlier in this video, where an individual character receives sympathetic treatment even while the broader plot surrounding that character reinforces a stereotype connected to the wider community they represent. This creates a familiar tension throughout the episode, where the specific individual relationship between Peter and Mahmoud plays out with warmth and genuine connection, while the larger storyline, built around a bombing plot, pulls the episode's overall message back toward the exact stereotype about Muslim communities and violence that critics of the show pointed to immediately upon the episode's release. What separates Turban Cowboy from many of the other examples discussed throughout this video, and what makes it worth examining as its own distinct case, rather than simply another entry in a list of stereotype-driven storylines, is the specific and unfortunate timing surrounding its original broadcast. The episode included a brief cutaway gag depicting Peter running over a crowd of people during a recreation of the Boston Marathon, a real and well-known annual running event held in Massachusetts. This particular joke, largely unrelated to the episode's main terrorism plot and existing mainly as one of the show's typical quick cutaway gags, took on a very different and far more serious meaning once the episode aired close to the timing of an actual bombing attack that occurred at the real Boston Marathon in 2013, an attack that killed several people and injured many more. The proximity between the episode's broadcast and the real-world tragedy created an association that critics and viewers found deeply troubling, even though the show's cutaway gag had been written and produced without any way of knowing that a real attack would occur at the same event within a similar window of time. This situation raises an important distinction worth stating clearly, since it separates Turban Cowboy from other examples of controversy discussed throughout this video in a meaningful way. The show's writers could not have known in advance that a real bombing would occur at the Boston Marathon around the same time this episode was scheduled to air, meaning the specific and painful coincidence connecting the episode's content to the real tragedy was not something built intentionally into the episode from the start. This differs significantly from a situation where a network or a writing team knowingly includes material they already understand to be closely tied to a recent real-world event. At the same time, the fact that the connection was accidental accidental rather than intentional does not erase the discomfort many viewers understandably felt encountering a joke about running over a crowd at the Boston Marathon so close to a moment when a real attack at that exact event had recently caused genuine loss of life. Both of these facts exist together, the accidental nature of the timing and the genuine discomfort the timing produced, and a complete account of this particular controversy needs to hold both of them at once, rather than resolving the tension entirely in one direction or the other. Separate from the specific timing issue connected to the Boston Marathon reference, the episode's broader terrorism plot generated its own independent wave of criticism upon release, unconnected to any real-world event and based purely on the content of the storyline itself. Critics and commentators covering the episode pointed specifically to the sheer number of jokes built around Islamic culture and tradition packed into a single episode, arguing that the concentration of this material in one 22-minute episode went well beyond the show's usual pattern of scattering occasional jokes about a topic across many different episodes over time. This particular criticism connects back to a pattern already discussed earlier in this video regarding the Weinstein episode, where a single concentrated dose of stereotype-driven material inside one episode tends to draw sharper and more focused criticism than the same material would likely draw if it were spread out more thinly across a larger number of episodes over a longer period of time. It is worth placing this episode next to the earlier discussion of the Weinstein episode specifically, since both episodes represent full-length storylines built entirely around a single religious community, rather than scattered jokes spread across the show's larger cast of background characters. The Weinstein episode faced its most serious consequence before broadcast, when Fox itself made the decision to hold the episode back from the air entirely. Turban Cowboy faced no such intervention, airing exactly as scheduled, with no advance concern raised by the network prior to broadcast. This difference is worth noting because it raises a reasonable question about why one episode, built around Jewish stereotypes connected to money, received this kind of advance caution from the network, while a separate episode, built around Muslim stereotypes connected to terrorism, did not receive the same treatment, despite covering material that many critics ultimately found equally troubling once it reached audiences. There is no single confirmed explanation available for why the network handled these two situations so differently, though the different historical weight carried by each specific stereotype, discussed at length in the previous section regarding the Weinstein episode, may offer at least a partial explanation for why one topic triggered advance caution while the other did not. The episode's ending, in which Peter successfully escapes the bombing plot and the immediate danger passes, follows a fairly standard structure for how the show typically resolves its more dramatic or action-oriented storylines, wrapping up the tension quickly and returning to its usual comedic tone by the episode's final scenes. This kind of quick resolution is worth noting because it stands in fairly stark contrast to the seriousness of the subject matter driving the plot up until that point. A storyline built around a planned bombing attack, a subject connected to real and devastating violence that has affected many communities around the world, gets wrapped up within the show's usual comedic pacing and structure, treated with the same overall tone the show might use to resolve a much lower-stakes storyline about a misunderstanding between friends or a minor family dispute. This tonal choice, treating an extremely serious, real-world subject with the same light-hearted comedic resolution the show applies to nearly everything else it covers, is itself worth naming as part of a complete account of how this particular episode handles its subject matter from beginning to end. Taken as a whole, Turban Cowboy represents one of the clearest examples across the entire history of the show of how a single episode can generate controversy through multiple separate channels at once. The underlying terrorism plot draws directly on a well-documented and frequently criticized stereotype, connecting Muslim communities to violent extremism, generating criticism purely on the basis of its content, regardless of any outside timing or coincidence. Layered on top of that underlying issue, the specific cutaway gag referencing the Boston Marathon created an entirely separate and unplanned controversy, once real events overtook the episode's original broadcast timing, connecting the episode to genuine tragedy in a way its own writers could not have anticipated when the material was originally produced. Both of these issues exist together inside the same 22 minutes of television, making Turban Cowboy one of the more complicated single episodes to examine fully and fairly, compared to many of the other examples already covered throughout this video. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A different community entirely becomes the focus of an episode built around distance and desperation rather than fear. Following two of the Griffin family's most self-absorbed characters straight into some of the most exaggerated and most widely criticized jokes the show has ever told about a nation halfway across the world. Section 8. Native American Communities, Vision Quests, and Burial Grounds. Family Guy has returned to Native American culture and history on more than one occasion across its long run, and unlike some of the other groups already covered in this video, the show's treatment of this particular subject shows up in two distinctly different episodes with two very different tones. One episode uses Native American culture as the basis for a fairly standard sitcom plot, involving a family road trip and a casino visit. The other uses Native American history and spiritual belief as the trigger for a haunted house storyline built around ghosts and supernatural revenge. Looking at both of these episodes together gives a clearer picture of how the show has handled this particular subject over time than looking at either one alone. The earlier of these two episodes is called The Sun Also Draws, and it comes from the very first season of the show, making it one of the earliest examples of race-based comedy anywhere in the entire series. The plot follows the Griffin family after Chris is removed from his youth scouting group, prompting Peter to drive the family to the scout organization's headquarters in an attempt to get his son reinstated. Along the way, the family stops at a casino owned and operated by a Native American tribe, and during this stop, Lois ends up gambling away the family car. In order to try to win the car back, Peter pretends to be a member of the tribe himself, a deception that leads him into a ceremony known as a vision quest, a real spiritual practice found in various Native American traditions, generally involving a period of solitude, fasting, and reflection intended to help a person gain personal insight or connect with a sense of purpose. The episode uses this vision quest sequence as an opportunity for Peter and Chris to spend time together and strengthen their relationship as father and son, layering a fairly ordinary family bonding storyline on top of a setting built from Native American spiritual tradition. The comedy throughout this sequence draws heavily on visual stereotypes associated with Native American culture, including exaggerated versions of traditional clothing, and the casino itself is designed and decorated using imagery like teepees, a type of portable dwelling historically used by certain Plains tribes, but frequently applied inaccurately as a blanket symbol for Native American culture as a whole, regardless of which specific tribe or region is actually being depicted. Workers inside the casino are shown wearing feathers and other traditional style clothing, along with name tags bearing exaggerated, stereotypical names, a detail that flattens an enormously diverse collection of distinct tribes, languages, and traditions into a single, generic, cartoonish version of Native American identity. This flattening effect is worth examining closely, since it represents a specific and frequently discussed problem connected to how Native American culture gets depicted across American media more broadly, not just within this one episode of Family Guy. There are hundreds of distinct federally recognized tribes across the United States, each with its own separate history, language, spiritual practices, and cultural traditions, many of which differ from each other just as significantly as different European nations differ from one another. When popular media chooses to represent Native American culture using a single generic set of symbols, such as teepees, feathered headdresses, and vision quests. It erases this enormous diversity and replaces it with one simplified, interchangeable version of Native identity that does not accurately reflect any specific tribe's actual history or practices. The Sun Also Draws follows this exact pattern, building its casino setting and its vision quest sequence entirely around this generic, flattened version of Native American culture, rather than referencing any specific, real tribal tradition connected to a particular nation or region. The episode does include a moment near its conclusion that attempts to address its own use of stereotype directly, though the effectiveness of this moment has been debated by people who have written about the episode over the years. As the story wraps up, several characters, including Lois, Stewie, and Meg, are shown pushing back against stereotypes connected to Native Americans, Mexicans, and Swedish people, respectively, suggesting an attempt by the writers to acknowledge that the episode had been leaning on broad ethnic generalizations throughout its runtime. This closing moment functions as a kind of self-aware wink toward the audience, acknowledging that stereotypes had just been used extensively throughout the previous 20 minutes, while also gesturing toward the idea that stereotypes in general are inaccurate and worth questioning. Whether this brief closing acknowledgement meaningfully offsets the extended use of stereotype that came before it throughout the rest of the episode is a matter of ongoing disagreement among people who have examined the episode closely, since a short closing statement pushing back against stereotypes does not undo the accumulated effect of an entire episode built around visual and cultural shorthand for an extremely diverse and often misunderstood group of nations and peoples. The second major example connected to Native American culture on this show comes from a much later episode called Petergeist, which follows a completely different storyline built around horror movie conventions, rather than family road trip comedy. In this episode, Peter decides to build a large home theater system in his backyard after his neighbor Joe installs his own upgraded entertainment setup. And during construction, Peter discovers a Native American skull buried on his property. Rather than treating this discovery with any care or respect, Peter disturbs and desecrates the remains, and this act triggers a supernatural haunting that begins affecting the entire Griffin household. The haunting eventually escalates to the point where a poltergeist, a term used in various ghost and spirit traditions to describe a mischievous or aggressive spirit believed to be capable of causing physical disturbances, drags Stewie away into another dimension accessed through the family's television set, sparking a chaotic sequence of supernatural events throughout the rest of the episode. This particular storyline draws on a different and separate stereotype connected to Native American culture than the one found in The Sun Also Draws, shifting away from casino imagery and vision quests toward a much older and more widely used horror movie trope involving disturbed burial grounds and vengeful spirits. This particular trope has appeared across a large number of American horror films and television shows over many decades, frequently using Native American burial sites as a convenient plot device to trigger supernatural events, without engaging with any actual historical or cultural context connected to real burial practices, real spiritual beliefs, or the very real and painful history of Native American burial sites being disturbed, excavated, and disrespected by settlers and archaeologists throughout much of American history. Petergeist follows this well-worn horror movie formula closely, using Native American remains purely as a mechanism to kick off a ghost story, rather than engaging with any of the real history or real cultural weight connected to how Native American burial sites have actually been treated throughout the country's history. Comparing these two episodes side by side reveals two different, though related ways that a piece of entertainment can flatten and simplify a specific culture down into a convenient plot device. The Sun Also Draws uses Native American culture as the backdrop for a family bonding storyline, borrowing visual symbols and spiritual practices as decoration and atmosphere, without engaging seriously with their actual actual meaning or significance. Petergeist uses Native American history as the trigger mechanism for a horror plot, treating a burial site and its remains as a convenient source of supernatural danger rather than as something connected to real people, real families, and real cultural practices surrounding death and remembrance. Neither episode spends meaningful time developing an actual Native American character with a personality, a name, or a story of their own, meaning that across both of these examples, Native American culture appears on screen primarily as scenery, tradition, or plot device, rather than through any specific individual character the audience gets to know, the way audiences get to know Cleveland Brown or Trisha Takanawa from earlier sections of this video. This absence of any actual named, ongoing Native American character across either of these two storylines is itself worth naming clearly, since it sets this particular example apart from nearly every other group discussed throughout this video so far. Cleveland Brown, despite the issues connected to his voice pattern, receives an entire family, a spin-off series, and dozens of individual storylines spread across many years. Trisha Takanawa, despite constantly being reduced to her ethnic label, still receives a consistent recurring role with her own small arcs and her own moments of genuine emotion. Even Max Weinstein and Mahmoud, despite existing within episodes built around serious stereotypes, are given names, personalities, and individual relationships with Peter that carry at least some warmth and specificity. Native American culture, by comparison, appears across the show's history primarily through casino workers and buried remains, without a single ongoing named character built with anywhere near the same level of individual presence given to characters representing several of the other groups already covered in this video. This difference matters because it suggests a distinct pattern in how the show approaches different cultures depending on how directly connected that culture is to the show's regular setting and regular cast of characters. Groups like Black Americans, Asian Americans, and Jewish Americans appear throughout the show, embedded directly into the everyday life of Quahog, woven into the town's news station, its social circles, and its business community. Native American culture, by contrast, appears mainly as something the Griffin family encounters temporarily during a road trip, or something buried beneath their own backyard, treated as separate from ordinary daily life in Quahog rather than integrated into it. This distinction reflects a broader and well-documented pattern found across much of American media more generally, where Native American people and Native American history often get treated as something belonging to the past or to a separate, distant setting, rather than being represented as an ongoing, present-day part of everyday American life and community, the same way other groups frequently are. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Reaching the end of this examination of Native American representation across the show's history highlights a fitting question worth carrying forward, since another entire nation, one located thousands of miles away from Quahog rather than buried beneath it, receives its own dedicated episode later in the show's run, one built specifically around a romantic relationship that pulls two of the family's most self-involved characters directly into a culture the show depicts with an entirely different set of assumptions and an entirely different set of jokes. Section 9. South Asian and Indian Communities. Road to India. Family Guy built a long-running tradition throughout its history known internally as the Road to episodes, a recurring series of stories following Brian Griffin, the family's talking dog, and Stewie, the family's infant son with an advanced intellect and a talent for building working inventions, as the two travel together to a new destination each time. This format borrows its name and its general structure from a series of old comedy films from the 1940s that also followed two main characters traveling to unusual locations together. Across the run of the show, Brian and Stewie visited several different destinations through this recurring format, and the eighth and final entry in this series is called Road to India, which aired as the season finale of the show's 14th season. This This episode gives a full 22 minutes of screen time to South Asian and Indian culture specifically, making it one of the clearest single-episode examples in the entire series of how the show handles a culture it rarely engages with directly outside of this one storyline. The episode opens with Brian falling for a woman named Padma, who works at a technology support company and who he initially connects with over the phone while trying to fix a problem with his computer. Brian, already established across many earlier episodes as a character who frequently sees himself as intellectually superior and emotionally sophisticated compared to the humans around him, quickly becomes infatuated with Padma after this initial phone conversation, eventually deciding that he wants to pursue a real relationship with her, despite having never met her in person and knowing almost nothing about her life or her background. Stewie, who frequently serves as Brian's traveling companion throughout this entire series of episodes, agrees to accompany him on the journey, and the two set off together to find Padma and pursue the relationship Brian has become convinced is worth chasing across a significant distance. Before the two characters even arrive in India, the episode signals its general comedic approach through a series of jokes built around geography and cultural assumption. In one exchange between the two characters early in their journey, Stewie makes a comment expressing surprise at seeing a taxicab with fewer than 9 passengers crammed inside it, playing directly on a widely repeated stereotype about overcrowding in Indian transportation systems. A similar joke appears shortly afterward, when Stewie steps off an extremely overcrowded bus that the episode depicts as carrying an unrealistic number of passengers, along with live chickens riding as passengers as well, prompting Stewie to remark that he feels he owes every bus in America an apology for how empty they seem by comparison. Both of these jokes rely entirely on a generic idea of Indian transportation as chaotic and overcrowded, rather than referencing any specific city, region, or documented reality connected to actual transportation conditions anywhere in the country. Once Brian finally connects with Padma in person, the plot takes its central turn when she invites him to a party that Brian assumes is a casual social gathering, only to discover once he arrives that the event is actually her engagement dinner, celebrating her upcoming marriage to a man chosen for her by her family, rather than a partner she selected on her own. This detail introduces the practice of arranged marriage into the episode's central plot, a real and long-standing tradition found across many South Asian cultures, where families take an active role in selecting marriage partners for their children, often based on considerations like family background, financial stability, and shared community or religious ties, rather than the couple's own prior romantic relationship. Arranged marriage remains a common and accepted practice across large portions of India today, with research on the subject indicating that a very large majority of marriages across the country continue to be arranged in some form, meaning the episode's use of this practice is not built around a fabricated or invented idea, but rather references something that reflects a genuine and widely documented part of Indian society and family life. Because arranged marriage is a real and accepted practice rather than a fabricated stereotype, the episode's decision to build a plot around it does not automatically qualify as inaccurate or offensive purely by including the concept itself. The more significant issue connected to this section of the episode comes from how the show chooses to build comedy around the practice once it has been introduced into the plot, rather than from the simple fact that the practice appears in the story at all. Brian's reaction to discovering Padma's engagement and his subsequent decision to actively interfere with her planned marriage in order to pursue his own romantic interest in her instead positions the entire storyline in a way that treats Padma's family's involvement in her marriage decision as an obstacle for Brian's personal romantic pursuit to overcome, rather than treating the practice itself with any real interest in understanding why why it holds such a significant and accepted place within the culture it comes from. The plot thickens further once the episode introduces the specific method by which Brian attempts to pay off Padma's dowry, a term referring to money, property, or other forms of wealth that one family traditionally provides to another as part of arranging a marriage in various cultures around the world, including in parts of India. Rather than depicting this financial arrangement with any real detail or context, the episode has Brian raise money by taking a job removing tapeworms, a type of parasite that can infect the human digestive system, specifically from the bodies of Indian people depicted within the episode. This particular plot detail draws directly on old and widely criticized stereotypes, connecting India to poor sanitation, parasitic disease, and general uncleanliness, ideas that have circulated across Western media for a very long time, and that public health researchers and cultural critics have pointed to repeatedly as inaccurate and reductive generalizations that ignore the reality of a massive, modern country home to well over 1 billion people living across an enormous range of different economic and social conditions, including large cities with advanced medical systems and technology industries employing millions of people, the very same technology industry that brought Brian and Padma together in the first place through her original tech support job. This particular joke stands out as worth examining closely because of how directly it contradicts another element already present within the same episode. Padma herself works in the technology support industry, a modern, globally connected profession that reflects India's genuine and well-documented position as a major center for technology and business outsourcing work, employing millions of people across the country in skilled, professional positions connected to companies and customers located all around the world. The episode introduces Padma through this entirely modern, professional context, only to pivot a short time later toward using tapeworm removal, one of the oldest and most reductive stereotypes about the country, as the basis for a major plot point involving Brian's fundraising efforts. This creates a strange internal contradiction within the same 22 minutes of television, presenting India simultaneously as a modern, technologically connected nation through Padma's career and as a source of parasitic disease and poor sanitation through Brian's fundraising method, without the episode itself appearing to notice or address this contradiction at any point. The episode's use of the bindi, a traditional forehead marking worn by many people across South Asian cultures, particularly within Hindu tradition, and carrying different specific meanings depending on the exact cultural and religious context in which it is worn, becomes the basis for another joke examined and specifically singled out by multiple television critics who reviewed the episode after its original broadcast. According to reviews published at the time, the episode includes a scene involving Indian characters being physically stopped or incapacitated by having pressure applied to their bindi, turning a marking that carries genuine religious and cultural significance for many of the people who wear it into a simple physical gag, rather than treating it with any awareness of its actual meaning or importance. Reviewers covering the episode noted this particular joke specifically, with one reviewer for the entertainment site TV Fanatic describing the joke as extremely funny, while also directly acknowledging that it was, in her own words, one of the most culturally offensive things she had personally seen the show do, showing that even television critics generally willing to embrace the show's typical style of humor found this particular joke difficult to fully defend, even while admitting they found it funny in the moment. Critical reception of the episode overall was largely negative when it was first broadcast, and the specific criticism raised by professional television reviewers at the time offers a useful outside perspective beyond simply analyzing the jokes directly. Jesse Skadine, a writer for the entertainment website IGN, gave the episode a score of 4.4 out of 10, one of the lower scores given to any Road to episode across the entire series. In his review, Skadine specifically criticized the jokes connected to India as relying heavily on old, overused cultural cliches, mentioning specifically the episode's references to overpopulation, the religious reverence myths many Hindus hold for cows, and the bindi joke discussed above, arguing that these jokes leaned on ideas about India that had already been used repeatedly across other forms of media long before this particular episode ever aired. A separate review, published by the entertainment site TV Equals, written by Mark Trammell, offered a somewhat more mixed assessment, describing the Indian references as cliched, while still finding some enjoyment in the episode's extended musical sequence, discussed further below, which the reviewer described as genuinely entertaining, despite the surrounding material built around cultural stereotype. The episode includes an extended musical sequence built in the visual and musical style of Bollywood, the popular name commonly used to describe the large and highly influential Hindi-language film industry based in Mumbai, India, known internationally for producing movies that frequently include elaborate musical and dance sequences as a central part of their storytelling tradition. Family Guy has used large-scale musical numbers as a recurring device across many different episodes throughout its history, not limited specifically to episodes connected to any one culture, and the Bollywood-inspired sequence found in Road to India follows this same general pattern, borrowing the visual style, choreography, and musical structure associated with this specific and genuinely influential film tradition. Several reviewers who covered the episode after its release specifically praised this musical sequence as one of the stronger elements of the episode, suggesting that when the show engaged directly with an actual, specific, and well-known artistic tradition connected to Indian culture, rather than relying on vague generalizations about sanitation or overcrowding, the resulting material was generally better received than the broader collection of stereotype-driven jokes surrounding it throughout the rest of the episode. This distinction between the show's engagement with a specific, well-documented cultural tradition like Bollywood filmmaking compared to its reliance on vague, generalized stereotypes about overcrowding, disease, and sanitation offers a useful pattern worth naming clearly as part of a full examination of this episode. When the show's writers appear to have researched or referenced something specific and identifiable, such as an actual film genre with a real name, a real history, and a real set of stylistic conventions that can be accurately imitated and parodied, the resulting comedy tends to draw a more favorable response, even from critics generally skeptical of the show's handling of race and culture. When the show instead falls back on vague, non-specific ideas floating around in general popular culture, such as overcrowded buses or parasitic disease, without connecting those ideas to any particular, verifiable detail about the actual country being depicted, the resulting material tends to draw sharper and more direct criticism for relying purely on lazy, second-hand cultural assumption rather than anything resembling actual research or specific cultural knowledge. The episode's ending brings its central storyline to a resolution that stands out somewhat compared to many of the other examples discussed throughout this video. Rather than following through with his original plan to pay off Padma's dowry and effectively purchase his way into a relationship with her against her family's wishes, Brian ultimately decides to be honest with Padma about his feelings, rather than continuing to interfere indirectly with her existing arranged engagement. According to reviews covering the episode's conclusion, Brian's choice to act honestly rather than manipulatively marks a noticeable shift compared to his usual pattern of behavior across many other episodes, where he frequently pursues romantic interests through more self-serving or manipulative means. This more honest resolution also connects to the episode ultimately helping Padma escape from her arranged marriage situation, though the episode frames this outcome primarily around Brian's own personal growth and decision-making, rather than spending significant time developing Padma's own independent perspective on her situation, her family, or her own feelings about the arrangement she had been placed into before Brian's arrival disrupted it. This imbalance, where an outside character's personal growth becomes the emotional center of a storyline that is technically about a woman from a different culture escaping an arranged marriage, connects to a broader pattern already discussed at several points earlier in this video. Padma, much like Isabella from the earlier storyline covering Mexican and Latino immigration, functions primarily as a supporting figure whose situation exists mainly to teach the show's own established main character something about himself, rather than existing as a fully developed individual whose own inner life, motivations, and feelings receive equal attention and equal narrative weight compared to the Griffin family member at the center of the story. This pattern shows up repeatedly across the show's various storylines involving characters from cultures outside of Quahog's usual setting, suggesting a fairly consistent structural habit within the show's overall approach to these kinds of episodes, regardless of which specific culture or country happens to be the subject of that particular episode. It is also worth noting a separate joke included within this same episode, unrelated directly to India, but relevant to understanding the episode's overall comedic approach, involving a reference to Jeb Bush, an American politician who was actively running for president at the time this episode originally aired in 2016. This detail is worth including because it shows that Road to India, much like many other Family Guy episodes, frequently blends its central cultural storyline together with completely unrelated topical references pulled from current events happening at the exact time the episode was being written and produced. This habit of blending unrelated topical jokes into an episode otherwise focused on a specific cultural subject appears consistently across the show's history, and it shows up again in the immigration-focused episode discussed earlier in this video, through its brief reference to political commentary connected to the same general time period. Taken as a whole, Road to India presents one of the clearest single-episode case studies available anywhere in the show's history for examining exactly how Family Guy tends to blend genuine cultural specificity together with generic, second-hand stereotype within the very same 22 minutes of television. The episode engages directly and specifically with real elements of Indian culture and society, including the accepted practice of arranged marriage, the country's major and genuinely influential role in the global technology industry, and the distinctive visual and musical style of Bollywood filmmaking, each of which reflects something real and documented about the country, rather than something invented purely for comedic purposes. At the same time, the episode leans just as heavily on vague, generic, and widely criticized stereotypes about overcrowded transportation, parasitic disease, and casual disregard for religious symbols like the bindi, none of which require any specific knowledge about India to construct, and all of which could plausibly be inserted into a joke about the country by someone with only the most surface-level, second-hand familiarity with the culture being depicted. Both of these approaches exist side by side within the same single episode, making Road to India a useful final example before shifting the focus of this video entirely away from outside characters and cultures and back toward the Griffin family itself, specifically toward Peter Griffin, whose own layered and complicated ethnic identity ties together several of the different threads already explored across this entire examination. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Peter Griffin sits at the center of two entirely separate ethnic identities across this show's history, one inherited from his own father and one discovered by accident decades into his own life, and pulling both of those threads together into a single complete picture closes this examination exactly where it needs to end, back inside the Griffin household itself. Section 10. Peter's own ethnicity: Irish, Mexican, and the joke turned inward. Every group examined across this entire video so far has existed at some distance from the Griffin family itself, appearing as neighbors, coworkers, reporters, friends, or people encountered during a trip away from Quahog. This final section turns that lens directly onto Peter Griffin, the show's own lead character, and traces how his personal ethnic identity became one of the strangest and most self-contradicting threads in the entire series. Peter is not simply a white American man written without any ethnic background at all. Across the show's run, his identity gets built, questioned, and rebuilt more than once, and pulling those pieces together reveals something that connects almost every idea already covered throughout this video. Peter's baseline identity, established early in the show and referenced consistently throughout most of its run, is Irish American. His mother, Thelma Griffin, and his father, Francis Griffin, are both written as characters connected to Irish heritage, with Francis in particular presented as a strict disciplinarian figure connected to a specific old-fashioned brand of Irish Catholic upbringing. Peter's own personality, especially his heavy drinking habits and his frequent visits to the Drunken Clam, the local bar where he spends much of his free time with Cleveland, Quagmire, and Joe, draws on a long-standing and widely recognized stereotype connecting Irish identity to alcohol consumption. This particular stereotype has a long history in American culture, tracing back to the treatment of Irish immigrants during the 19th century, a period when Irish immigrants faced significant discrimination and were frequently stereotyped in American newspapers and popular culture as prone to drunkenness, laziness, and violence. Family Guy inherits this old stereotype and applies it directly to Peter, using his drinking habits as one of his most consistent and most frequently repeated character traits across the entire history of the show. What makes this particular piece of Peter's identity worth including in a video otherwise focused on jokes about race is the specific position Irish identity occupies within the broader history of how different groups have been categorized in the United States. Irish immigrants, upon first arriving in large numbers during the 19th century, were frequently not considered fully white by the standards of American society at the time, facing discrimination, exclusion from certain jobs, and stereotyping that in some ways paralleled treatment given to other marginalized groups during that same period. Over time, through a long and complicated social process that researchers studying American immigration history have written about extensively, Irish Americans gradually came to be accepted as fully white within mainstream American society, losing much of the specific ethnic discrimination their earlier generations had faced. Peter's drinking-based comedy exists as a kind of leftover echo of that older discrimination, softened significantly by the passage of time and by Irish identity's eventual full acceptance into the American mainstream, meaning that jokes about Irish drinking habits carry a much lower level of ongoing, real-world harm compared to several of the other examples already discussed throughout this video, even while drawing from the exact same basic pattern of taking an old stereotype about a specific ethnic group and turning it into a permanent comedic trait for a character. This baseline Irish identity remained Peter's primary ethnic background for the first several seasons of the show, until the episode Padre de Familia, already examined in detail earlier in this video, introduced an entirely new and contradictory piece of information about his origins. As covered previously, this episode reveals that Peter was actually born in Mexico after his mother Thelma traveled there during an unplanned pregnancy resulting from an affair with an Irishman described within the episode as frequently drunk, a detail that directly reinforces the same Irish stereotype already built into Peter's father figure. This reveal means that Peter's biological father, at least according to the version of events given inside this particular episode, may not even be Francis Griffin, the man who raised him and who the show generally treats as his father throughout the rest of its run, since Thelma's affair with a different Irishman is what led directly to Peter's birth in Mexico in the first place. The episode does not spend significant time exploring this deeper question of biological biological paternity, choosing instead to focus its energy on the citizenship and immigration plot already examined in detail earlier in this video. But the detail remains present within the episode's own established storyline, regardless of how much attention the show itself chooses to give it. Placing this Mexican birth detail directly alongside Peter's established Irish heritage creates a genuinely unusual situation for a lead character on any television show, animated or otherwise. Peter spends the vast majority of the series functioning as an ordinary white American sitcom father, drawing his ethnic comedy almost entirely from Irish stereotypes about drinking and a general working-class Catholic upbringing. Then, for the span of exactly one episode, the show reveals that his actual country of birth is Mexico, technically making him, according to the very same immigration laws referenced within that specific episode, an undocumented immigrant for the entirety of his own life, without ever knowing it. This detail is never seriously addressed again in any significant way across the remaining seasons of the show that follow, with Peter returning to his usual established personality and his usual Irish-coded behavior patterns almost immediately once the episode concludes. This means Peter's Mexican birth functions as a contained single-episode plot device, rather than a permanent, ongoing piece of his character identity carried forward across future storylines, standing in sharp contrast to how consistently his Irish heritage and his associated drinking habits get referenced throughout the rest of the show's run. This inconsistency is worth naming directly, since it reveals something important about how Family Guy generally treats character backstory and continuity across its extremely long run. The show has never placed a particularly high value on maintaining strict, permanent continuity from one episode to the next, frequently introducing major revelations, deaths, returns from death, and other significant plot developments that get quietly abandoned or contradicted in later episodes without any explanation offered to the audience. Peter's Mexican birth fits neatly into this broader pattern, existing as a memorable and significant plot point for exactly one episode, before essentially disappearing from the show's ongoing internal continuity, treated by later episodes as though the revelation had never happened at all. This differs from the Cleveland Brown accent discussed earlier in this video, which remained a permanent and unchanging piece of that character across the entire show's run, or from Trisha Takanawa's ethnic labeling, which likewise persisted consistently across every appearance she makes throughout the series. Peter's Mexican identity, by comparison, appears once, generates its entire storyline within a single episode, and then vanishes almost completely from the show's ongoing sense of who Peter actually is. Looking at what this specific inconsistency reveals about the show's overall approach to race across its long history connects directly back to nearly every other example already examined throughout this video. When Family Guy builds a joke around a permanent, recurring side character, that joke tends to remain fixed and consistent, repeated across many episodes and many years without significant change, as seen clearly with Cleveland's voice pattern and Trisha's ethnic label. When the show instead builds a joke around one of its own main characters, someone whose personality, relationships, and role within the family need to remain generally stable and recognizable across hundreds of episodes stretching over multiple decades, race and ethnicity become something the show can introduce, use for comedic effect, and then quietly set aside once the specific episode built around that idea has concluded. Peter's identity needs to remain flexible enough to support whatever new storyline the writers want to explore in any given week, and his Mexican birth, however dramatic and significant it seemed within its own episode, ultimately gets treated as disposable once that particular episode's plot has run its course. This flexibility surrounding Peter's own identity stands in direct contrast to how rigidly the show treats identity when it comes to nearly every side character examined throughout the rest of this video. Cleveland cannot simply stop having his specific accent partway through the series without some kind of explanation, since audiences have come to expect that particular trait as a fixed part of who he is. Trisha cannot simply stop stop being introduced by her ethnicity without the show losing one of its most consistent and most recognizable running jokes. Peter, however, can be revealed as an undocumented Mexican immigrant for an entire episode and then return to his usual Irish-coded personality the following week without the show ever needing to explain or resolve the apparent contradiction this creates. This difference reveals an underlying hierarchy in how the show treats identity depending on a character's overall importance and permanence within the larger structure of the series. Side characters get fixed, permanent racial and ethnic traits that rarely change across their entire time on screen. The show's own central, ongoing characters get to treat their own ethnic identity as something temporary and adjustable, useful for generating a single, strong storyline before being set aside in favor of whatever comes next. Bringing this pattern back around to connect with everything already covered throughout this entire video reveals a consistent theme running underneath every single example examined so far, regardless of which specific group or which specific episode was under discussion. Family Guy repeatedly draws its racial and ethnic humor from a large, pre-existing pool of cultural stereotypes that already existed in American entertainment and American popular culture long before this particular show ever began, rather than inventing new ideas from scratch. Cleveland's accent, Trisha's model minority coding, the Weinstein episode's connection between Jewish identity and money, the terrorism plot underlying Turban Cowboy, the burial ground trope used in Petergeist, the overcrowded transportation and tapeworm jokes found in Road to India, and even Peter's own Irish drinking habits and his brief Mexican identity. All of these examples pull from stereotypes with long, well-documented histories, stretching back well before Family Guy existed as a television show at all. The series functions less as an original source of new ideas about different ethnic groups and more as a kind of collection point, gathering up existing cultural assumptions from many different decades and many different sources and redistributing them across its enormous cast of characters and its very long run of episodes, stretching across more than 2 decades of continuous production. This collection point function helps explain why the show's treatment of race can feel so inconsistent when examined closely across many different episodes and many different groups, since the show is not working from a single, unified philosophy about race that it applies evenly across every storyline. Instead, each individual episode or each individual character seems to pull from whatever specific stereotype happened to already exist in the broader culture surrounding that particular group, applied by whichever specific writer happened to be working on that particular episode at that particular point in the show's long history. Some of these borrowed ideas, like the golf course scene involving Cleveland, end up exposing prejudice rather than reinforcing it. Others, like the tapeworm joke in Road to India, simply repeat an old, reductive idea without much additional thought or context layered on top of it. The show's writers across more than 20 years of production do not appear to have followed one single consistent standard for how carefully or how thoughtfully each of these borrowed stereotypes should be handled once they made their way into a finished episode. Peter Griffin, sitting at the exact center of the Griffin family and therefore at the exact center of the entire show, ends up serving as a kind of living summary of this entire pattern once his own layered identity gets examined closely. He carries an old, softened stereotype about Irish drinking habits as a permanent piece of his personality, stretched consistently across the entire run of the series. He briefly carries a completely different ethnic identity for the span of one single episode, treated with far more narrative weight and far more direct engagement with real-world immigration law and policy than almost any other example examined throughout this video, before that identity gets quietly set aside and mostly forgotten forgotten by the episodes that follow. And through his friendships, his workplace, his neighborhood, and his family, he sits at the center of a web of relationships connecting him directly to nearly every other example already covered across this entire video. From Cleveland and Quagmire at the Drunken Clam, to Mahmoud at the hospital, to the immigrant workers on Carter's estate, to Max Weinstein and his financial advice. Looking back across this entire examination as a whole, from the news desk explored at the very beginning, through Peter's own layered and often contradictory identity explored here at the end, a clear picture emerges of a show that never developed one single consistent method for handling race across its long history. Some moments expose real prejudice with genuine precision, as seen clearly in the golf course scene. Other moments simply repeat old, tired stereotypes without much additional thought, as seen in several of the jokes built around Asian characters, Native American burial grounds, and Indian sanitation. Some episodes generate enough concern in advance to be pulled from broadcast entirely, as happened with the Weinstein episode, while others air exactly on schedule, despite covering equally serious subject matter, as happened with Turban Cowboy. And running through the very center of all of it sits Peter Griffin himself, a character whose own ethnic identity shifts, contradicts itself, and ultimately reveals just how flexible and how inconsistent this show's entire approach to race and identity has been across more than 2 decades of continuous production, built one borrowed stereotype at a time, applied unevenly across a cast of characters who were never all treated by the same set of rules. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.